Hello everyone, welcome back to Bonepile Miniatures. In this video we will continue our discussion about the Bonepile Miniatures Mixed Rule Set, which is our version of the 9th edition of Warhammer Fantasy. And this is video number 5 of a series. Our previous videos have covered topics such as the basic rules, turn phase rules, special rules, and army detail rules. And this video will be about the terrain rules. And the purpose of this video series is to inform those watching our channel about how we play our games of Warhammer Fantasy. And this will provide a reference to make sense of our battle reports. Feel free to make comments and ask questions, but we are not competing with other 9th editions of Warhammer Fantasy. This is just simply how we like to do things at our club. Now, most of these rules have been influenced by the Warhammer Armies Project, but we have not adopted all of their ideas, and we have modified some of theirs. And in addition, we've developed some of our own ideas. And that's why we call it a mixed rule set, because it combines ideas from different sources. So I recommend that if you have not watched videos 1 through 4, that you pause this video and go back and watch those before this one, in order to get a better understanding of these rules. And our rules documents are written very concisely and omit a lot of details. They are intended for those already familiar with the 8th edition of Warhammer Fantasy. And if you are not familiar with the 8th edition, you may need to study that rule book in conjunction with this one to get a better understanding of how these rules work. And the pages I will show you will have both black and red text on them. The black text denotes rules that are consistent with the 8th edition of the Warhammer Fantasy. And the text in red are changes that we have made. And these rules are also available on our hobby blog, which is bonepileminiatures.com, as well as many other rule supplements. Now, before we dive into the terrain rules, I should make you aware that our club is a great fan of the terrain aspect of the game. We like terrain, and we like plenty of it, and like to use it in the strategy of our games. Now, we don't have a lot of it at our disposal yet, but we think that terrain is one of the things that makes this game so much fun. It seems like the terrain is a third player at times, but we know that many players don't feel the same way about terrain. A lot of players like to set the terrain in a corner and try to avoid it as much as they can, but we are not that way. So as we discuss our terrain rules, you will notice that we have increased the influence of terrain. And this is one of the major ways that we have parted with the Warhammer Armies Project. In some cases, it seems as if that version hit the easy button for terrain, where we went the opposite direction and turned up the dial a notch or two. To me, the appeal of terrain is that it gives a general a chance to even the odds against a superior foe. I think about the ancient general Sun Tzu, who wrote the Art of War book. He made a lot of emphasis about mastering the terrain and even the weather to win battles. And many armies in history were very good at using the terrain to their advantage. And so we think it is fun to experience a degree of the effects that terrain can have on a Warhammer battle. And we have developed all kinds of extra terrain features and elements that help spice up the variety of terrain options to our games. We even like to have wild animals and beasts roaming around the board to add extra flavor. But the rules we will discuss today are the main rules that apply to most games. So now let's dive in and discuss our terrain rules. And here's page 1. It starts off talking about the 4 major categories of terrain. And before each game starts, both players need to fully understand where each of these terrain types exist on the board. So there's open terrain, dangerous terrain, mysterious terrain, and impassable terrain. So first we come to the open terrain, which has all the same rules as the 8th edition. And then we go to dangerous terrain, and there are some changes. So let me read the paragraph, which says, marches, charges, flees, overruns, and pursuits into dangerous terrain require a dangerous terrain test. Roll a d6 for each model. Fails on a 1. Flees, overruns, and pursuits fail on a 1 or 2. No armor saves allowed, and a chariot takes d6 wounds. And it does not state explicitly, but ward saves are allowed for dangerous terrain. And we've explained the reason for these changes in previous videos. Mainly we think that dangerous terrain should be even more dangerous when troops are in a panic, or other similar movements like overrun and pursue. And now let's move on to the mysterious terrain, which is determined when entering. And that means the exact type of mysterious terrain with all of its rules is not known until you enter it, whether it be a forest or a river or whatever. But then we added, you may roll at the beginning of the game to see which pieces of terrain are ordinary and which are mysterious. On a d6 of 4+, it is mysterious. And a team may discover the mysterious terrain within their deployment zone after they deploy, but before the first game round. So let me explain this. In the normal setup of terrain in the 8th edition rulebook, it seems like there is a very little chance to have normal terrain, like a normal forest or a normal river. And since we like to have a lot of terrain on the battlefield, we wanted to modify the chances of normal terrain occurring. And so it's not all mysterious and all deadly. But we give the players of the game this option. And I would like to emphasize options, because everyone has different comfort levels with terrain features. And so we give players multiple approaches here. The important thing is that the two players playing the game agree with what to do. And you can set up the terrain just like the 8th edition book prescribes, or you can use this method which we recommend. But if you and your opponent would like to follow this method, this is what we do. Once all the terrain has been placed on the battlefield, we roll a die for each terrain piece to determine if it is mysterious. On a d6 of a 4+, it is mysterious. But if it fails, it is not mysterious, but a normal piece of terrain. Now you must use a little bit of discretion here. For some pieces of terrain, you would not perform this procedure. For example, if there is a piece of terrain that is obviously mysterious, because some terrain items are purposely built and intended to be mysterious, and so there's no need to roll a d6 to determine that. Also, if there's terrain that is clearly meant to be normal, then there's no need to roll a d6 for it. An example might be a lone tree or a road sign or a stack of barrels or something like that. The emphasis for our purposes is that the terrain setup should be modular, according to the preferences of the two players involved. We don't think there should be a one-size-fits-all approach. You might even drum up a scenario you want to play that calls for a specific list of terrain. And we don't think that there should be a big problem with doing that. But for most games, what we do is what is described in this paragraph about mysterious terrain, especially when it comes to forests, rivers, hills, and marshes, and common things like that. We roll a d6 to see whether each piece is normal or mysterious. And if it is mysterious, then the exact voodoo associated with that terrain piece is determined when it is entered. Except we allow that if a mysterious terrain piece is within your deployment zone, you can find out what the mystery is after deployment, but before the first round of the game. And we are assuming that your general would send a scout to determine what that mysterious terrain is. But that's an option too. If you want, you can leave it a surprise for the game and find out during the action. But we allow that to happen if you would like to do it. And once again, I want to emphasize that the terrain options are really up to you and your opponent, and we think you should be able to decide for yourselves how you want to approach it. So let's move on to impassable terrain. And impassable terrain can only be entered when fleeing. No other moves are allowed to cross into it. And since it is impassable, we require a dangerous terrain check. But this time it fails on a 1 to a 3. And once again, it seems like nobody should be able to get a free pass on safety just because they are in a panic. Survival should be slim. And I think we are even being generous allowing a passage on a 4+, which is a 50% survival rate. And I would be willing to drop the survival rate even lower, but we are just going to leave it as a 4+ pass for now. And then after terrain types, we come to the terrain generator. And this is a copy of the normal 8th edition list. And we don't mind if anyone wants to use it. And I think this might be the best option if you have a small library of terrain items. Or this might be the best option if you prefer a very limited influence from terrain on the game. And this might be the best approach for beginners as well. You and your opponent should use this chart for those intentions. But in our club, we use a different approach. We have a whole separate supplement on setting up the terrain, and we call it the landscape generator. And I will not cover that supplement in this video, but I will produce another video that will be dedicated just to that. I plan to produce that video as soon as I can and show you that method for setting up the board. It is not necessarily a more complicated system or more difficult, but it just adds more variety and helps you set up a landscape theme. And unless we are setting up a battlefield for a specific scenario, we play all of our games using the landscape generator supplement. Okay, so let's move on from that. Now we will start getting into the details of each of the terrain choices. And these rules apply whether you use the 8th edition terrain generator or our version of the landscape generator. So the hills come up first, and like the 8th edition, they add +1 to combat resolution when fighting downhill. And they are normally considered open terrain. But we added a rule that hills add +6 inches to the general's inspiring presence. And I think that's a sensible rule. And then we add a paragraph below, and let me read what it says. A unit must clearly fit on a hill. Units overhanging cliffs do not fit. 1/2 of a model's base is okay. And it's okay if that's the case with more than one model in the unit, as long as no model has more than half of its base hanging over a cliff. And so we want that to be perfectly clear. A unit must be able to fit where you have placed it. No more units overhanging cliffs. And if you must, you should reform your unit to fit the hill. Remove the models from the movement tray and make it right. And then next there's some further explanations about rocky outcrops, or rocks in general. And it says, rocks below the unit's knees do not impede movement, including marching. And so you compare the model itself to the rocks, whether it's a man or a horse or a dog or a monster or a shrine. Rocks that confront more than one model above the knee, but below the waist of the models, prevent marching, but not charging, and etc. So this is applied when rocks are a little taller. They prevent marching, but nothing else. Then, rocks above more than one model's waist can only be scaled by lone models and skirmishers, but at 1/2 of the movement for the turn. Rocks above the waist prevent a unit from scaling together and prevents charges. The unit must go around the rocks. So I hope this is clear what we mean. There's basically 3 tiers of rock heights. Below the model's knees, between its knees and waist, and then above the waist. But you also ignore a rock if it is only in the way of one model in a unit, or one column of models. We assume that in those situations, that the one column of models would squeeze around the rock obstacle. But if the rocks are in the way of more than one column of models, then you use these rules. Rocks above the waist are not scalable by a unit, unless they are a lone model or a skirmisher's unit. But even for those models, they climb the rocks at 1/2 movement for the turn. Otherwise, a unit must go around the rocks to avoid these impediments to movement. And so this is an example where we have turned up the effects of terrain a notch or two. No more autopilot when scaling hills. Units must properly fit on the hill, and there's no jumping across rocks and cliffs without any attention to realistic movements. And now I didn't have space to note them here, but there are some different choices for mysterious hills available. But I recommend using either the list of hills from the 8th edition book, or maybe from the Warhammer Armies Project book, or we have a large list of hills available at the BonepileMiniatures.com hobby blog. But basically we have a long list of hills where you roll 4d6 dice, which makes for a lot of options and a lot of variety. Or you may want to design a hill of your own with its own special rules. We don't mind that either. As long as you and your opponent agree, that's all that should really matter. But I just wanted you to know that we have a large list of mysterious hills available at our blog, and that is what we use in our games. So after the section on hills, we get to the section on forests. And we follow most of the same rules as 8th edition. Chariots and cavalry and monstrous cavalry take dangerous terrain checks for march, charge, flee, pursue, and overrun into a forest. Dangerous terrain checks also apply to models using the fly rule within a forest. They provide soft cover, even if behind the forest, and no rank bonuses are allowed within. And skirmishers are stubborn within a forest. And that's all consistent with the 8th edition. But we've added another option below. And these are basically alternative rules for the cover rules when it comes to forests. So they say 4 inches of forest obscure a target, no line of sight and no shot is available, and then 2 to 4 inches of forest allow a shot but block 1/2 of the successful to hit rolls. And then less than 2 inches of forest block 1 successful to hit roll. And like I said, we would use these rules in place of the normal soft cover and hard cover rules for forests. So the intention with this rule is that the trees simply block a certain amount of successful to hit rolls when shooting into a forest. And it depends on how much forest is between the shooter and the target. And this doesn't matter whether the shooter is outside the forest or within it. And it doesn't matter whether the target is outside the forest or together with the shooters inside the forest. And so again, this ramps up the difficulty level of forests in our games. But I want to emphasize that this is an optional rule or an alternative rule. The normal soft cover rules are still there if that's how you prefer to do things. And in our club, we allow lots of options when it comes to terrain. But most of the time, we are going to be using this rule for our games, especially in our battle reports. And then after that, I did have room to place the list of different types of mysterious forests from the 8th edition book. Now once again, when it comes to mysterious terrain, it doesn't really matter to us whether you use the 8th edition list or the list from the Warhammer Armies Project or a list from anywhere else. You could make up your own list. or even predetermine what the exact forest you want it to be, especially if a scenario calls for a specific type. As long as you and your opponent agree upon what to do, then go for it. But once again, we have developed our own list of mysterious forests, and it is another 4d6 list of them. And you can find this list at bonepileminiatures.com. And we make these big lists because we like a lot of variety, and we think variety is fun, and we have no problem if you want to use our list for your games as well. The terrain aspect should be whatever floats your boat between you and your opponent, but in our games we're going to use our own 4d6 lists of mysterious terrain, including these forests. So now let's move on to the next page. And here we find the rules on rivers. And we've made no changes to the river rules. We follow all the same rules as the 8th edition. No marching, no rank bonuses, never steadfast, and we recommend a bridge or ford. And then I also placed the 8th edition list of mysterious rivers. But once again, we have a 4d6 list of mysterious rivers at our hobby blog, bonepileminiatures.com. Check those out if you want to, or use any other list that you prefer. But we prefer to use our big 4d6 list. Next is Marshland. Marshland is the same as the 8th edition. Models have a -1 to their movement. It is dangerous terrain except for skirmishers. And then cavalry, monstrous cavalry, and chariots fail dangerous terrain tests on a 1 and a 2. Marshland choices from the 8th edition are also listed there. Or once again, you can look to our hobby blog and find a big list of 4d6 marshes that we've produced. And then finally we come to obstacles. And there's a lot more red here. So let's see what we've done here. Now keep in mind that obstacles are mainly things like walls and fences, boulders and hedges and stuff like that. So under movement it says, obstacles are dangerous terrain except for swarms, monstrous cavalry, and monsters. So we assume that swarms are typically bugs or snakes or things like that that wouldn't get hurt by walls and fences. Also, monstrous cavalry should be able to easily jump over them, and monsters can step over them easily as well. But don't apply these rules if they don't make sense. If there's a really tall stone wall and it doesn't make sense for a monstrous cavalry to easily jump over it, then don't apply this exception. But most walls and fences are meant to block infantry and cavalry, so you must use discretion when applying larger models to these situations. But let's go on. So next it says, no marching or charging over obstacles. And there's a -1 movement penalty on turns that maneuver over the obstacle on any portion of the unit, except for monstrous cavalry and monsters. Again, this exception is assuming normal-sized fences, hedges, and walls. Furthermore, obstacles are impassable for chariots and shrines. They must go around. And then for most units, each rank that moves over the obstacle rolls a d6. On a 1, the rank suffers 1 wound. Now in the 8th edition, you rolled a d6 for every single model that crossed a fence or a wall. In our version, you only roll 1 d6 per rank. And that's because the 8th edition results were often too unbelievable in how much damage a simple fence could inflict upon a unit. And so that's one aspect of terrain that we toned down a little bit. But we didn't want to completely eliminate the danger that these obstacles can pose on a unit of warriors. Then it says armor and ward saves are allowed. When fleeing, pursuing, or overrunning over an obstacle, use the normal rules. And that's talking about anything mentioned above. Like chariots and shrines use impassable terrain rules. And they aren't dangerous terrain for swarms and monstrous cavalry and monsters. And then it says, roll a d6 for each rank to take dangerous terrain checks. Take wounds on a 1 or a 2, and no saves allowed. So a major change here is that there's no charging over fences and walls. And to me that just makes a lot of sense. You can maneuver around a wall for a charge, but you cannot go over it. It just seems inconceivable for a unit to be able to do that. Now you can charge into a unit if they are defending a wall or a fence, being in base contact with it. And we will cover that situation a bit more down in the combat section. Another change I want to emphasize is that fences and walls do slow down your units by -1 movement. Now we have play-tested that rule quite a bit. We tested making the movement 1/2 of your normal movement. But we found out that really slowed down the game too unnecessarily. Because the unit is already prevented from marching, and so that's a big enough movement penalty in most cases. And then the -1 movement twists the dagger even a little more. But we thought that 1/2 movement really interfered too much with the tempo of the game, and we decided to scratch that idea. So the -1 movement stands for now. And our intention with these terrain tweaks is not to totally ruin the game, but just to change things up a little bit and let each terrain bit have some influence on the game. Now one question that might arise is, what if a unit has to flee over a fence, but the fence doesn't block the entire unit, maybe only one column of models? So I don't really have that situation spelled out here in the rules, but what we would do is, if it only blocked one column of models, we would treat it like we did with the rocky ground covered in the hill section, where we would assume that the troops would squeeze in together momentarily to allow that single column to avoid the fence. But if it covers more than one column of models, then you must face the full effects of the flee rule for obstacles. So you would roll 1d6 per rank, even if it covered only a part of that unit. And that's how we would play that. Okay, so now let's move on to shooting. And there's no changes here from the 8th edition. Models in base contact with the barrier have cover from shooting attacks. And if the unit can shoot themselves, they ignore the effects of the obstacle. Now, of course, a unit doesn't have to be in base contact with a wall or a fence to block line of sight. But a majority of a unit's models must be behind the obstacle to benefit from cover. And that would be determined from the shooter's point of view. So fences and hedges are soft cover, and walls are hard cover, or any variety of obstacles that should be comparable to one of those two categories. And if there's a terrain piece that is questionable, you and your opponent should determine that before the game starts, so you are both on the same page before the action begins. And so now let's move on to combat. So if a unit is in base contact behind a barrier, then the barrier is essentially part of the unit when considering distances and etc. And then we made this change. It says, units charging into a unit with a barrier lose the +1 charge bonus for combat resolution, and any charge bonuses for weapons, and no impact hits from the charge. And we think this makes sense because the wall will pretty much absorb the energy from the charge and the impact hits from the large creature or chariot. And then the next change says, defended barriers also decrease fear and terror effects by 1 level on the unit. And so you may use barriers to help your unit against fear and terror causing units. And it may not ultimately make a difference on the survival of the unit against a monstrous beast, but it can give a puny unit of human infantry at least a small sense of false security. And so that's why we made that rule. Now the next change is another optional rule, and it says, to hit rolls of 1 are resolved on the obstacle. Impact hits may also be resolved on the obstacle. See Building Rules Supplement for a structure damage guide. And like I said, this is an optional rule, and I don't recommend it for new players. But we play this way. We have a whole supplement dedicated to the damage of buildings and structures, as well as walls and fences. We would imagine that a monster could completely demolish a fence or a wall if it wanted to free up access to a cowardly infantry unit hiding behind it. And of course that might spark a panic, and such. Those rules are detailed in our building supplement. So after that we have a few of the obstacle choices listed that come from the 8th edition rulebook. And now at the time of producing this video, we have not yet created a big list of mysterious fences and walls. But maybe we will create a list like that in the future. And so that wraps up the section on obstacles. And there were a lot of changes there. And it's possible that you will encounter some issues and problems with some of those rules. But our emphasis is to only do what makes sense. Don't apply a rule just for the rule's sake. Look at the barrier model and look at the troop models. Check the line of sight, and etc. If a situation just doesn't seem to fit with reality, then come up with a modification, or revert to an 8th edition rule, or a Warhammer Armies Project rule that makes better sense for the situation. But we really enjoy these rules on the obstacles, and we think they help bring the battlefield a little more alive. So now let's go to the next page. And here we find mystical monuments. And we pretty much treat these like obstacles. There's no marching or charging through monuments. And you follow all other rules for moving through obstacles when moving through monuments. Most monuments should be obvious whether they provide soft cover or hard cover. And if it is not obvious, roll a d6. On a 4+, it is hard cover. They should also follow all rules for combat with obstacles, and you should decide before the game whether a monument has barriers that may be defendable for shooting or combat purposes. And so essentially there's no more running and charging through these terrain pieces like they are not even there. Many of these pieces have fences and walls and other structural features. Maybe there's an altar or other kinds of physical objects. So treat them properly, but there's so much variety to what you could build or what models you could purchase that it is really up to you and your opponent to determine how to play that terrain piece. Are there doors, or are there barriers? Are there steps? And I'm not going to articulate here what should be done with each possible scenario. What about a wall of vines? Is that hard cover or soft cover? You'll have to look at the model and decide for yourself. But if you cannot decide, roll a d6 like I suggested. And if you think you have a monument that is similar to a building, and you want to use the building rules for charging into a unit with the monument, then do that. Don't be afraid to apply the rules that make the most sense. And so here we share the list of monuments from the 8th edition rulebook. But feel free to use any list you want. Use the one from the Warhammer Armies Project, use your own list, but for these terrain pieces we are not planning on providing a list. And that's simply because there's an infinite variety of mystical monuments that you could build. And in our club we pretty much build a terrain piece and create the rules that are always attached to that terrain piece. And so whenever that terrain piece is placed, those rules come with it. At least referring to the mystical monuments. And then the same thing goes for Arcane Architecture. All the same ideas associated with mystical monuments should apply to this section. Be creative. Do what makes sense. Treat obstacles like obstacles. Treat buildings like buildings. Treat rocks and hills like they should be. Just don't hit the easy button all the time. That's how we play terrain, and that's what we recommend to you. So let's move on to the next page. And this page is on buildings. And we did very little change to this page because these are the default 8th edition rules for buildings. Now if you prefer to use the Warhammer Armies Project rules, that is fine with us. But we have our own rules supplement for buildings. But we build our foundation off of the 8th edition rules. And our rules would definitely be more complicated, so we would recommend using these 8th edition original rules for beginning players. But we will probably not be releasing our building rules supplement for quite a while. We have not fully play-tested all of the rules yet. We have some good ideas, but they have not been fully tested. And until they are, we might play them and you might see them used in our battle reports. But we probably are not going to share any documents about them or any of the details until they've been a little more vetted than they are at this point. But the basic approach of our building rules is to avoid the one-size-fits-all approach that you see in the 8th edition rule set for buildings. Our basic concept include adapting the gameplay according to the specific building model that you have on the table. And so you actually play according to the physical model. And so you have to look at the physical features on it. How many doors does it actually have? Where are they located? What about the windows? How many floors does it have? What about the roof? Can you open the building and access the floors inside? And then you would adjust assaulting and defending the building according to those physical features. And so we would have a set of common principles that can be applied to all buildings and your specific one. And so in our games we would possibly have a battle at a doorway, and then maybe some battles inside on different floors, and there may be even separate battles in stairwells or even on the roof. Another major principle is that we would implement damage to buildings. Each door and each wall would have a toughness and a certain amount of hit points on them. And all these rules would be universally applicable to a small tent, or to a cottage, or all the way up to a large-scale fortress or even a castle, and everything in between. And so that's what we are brewing on our building supplement, but like I said, we are still in playtest mode with all those features. But at some point in the future, we will publish our building supplement, and so you will have to be patient for now. But they will be similar to siege rules that you may have seen in older Warhammer supplements or from the Lord of the Rings battle game from Games Workshop. But for the meantime, we are going to continue to default to the 8th edition rules for buildings in this rule guide. And so with that ends our discussion of the terrain rules. So let me summarize the changes here. Dangerous terrain checks apply to fleeing units and for overrun and pursue. They have a higher rate of failure than before, and impassable terrain has an even higher chance of failure than before. There's new rules on determining mysterious terrain. Hills boost the general's inspiring presence, and units must fit properly on hills. No more ignoring cliffs and outcrops. And then, forests obscure targets and block hits based upon the depth of the forest. And then obstacles are not invisible. They have effects on marching, charging, fleeing and defending. And they have effects on impact hits and fear and terror. And then overall, do what makes sense. Don't hit the easy button, and be creative. And don't forget to check our blog at bonepileminiatures.com for big lists of mysterious forests, rivers, hills, and marshes. And also check out our supplement on generating landscapes. And at some point we will release our guide to using buildings. And so this will wrap up our video on our terrain rules. And by now we have covered a lot of ground, pardon the pun. And I am planning on making another video after this one where I will explain what we do for magic items, magic lores, and army books. And it will just be a simple discussion to explain what we do. And then after that, you can look for some more videos dedicated to some of the extra supplements we have produced and use in our games, like the landscape generator, like we talked about in this discussion. And so I hope to catch you at the next video. And until then, and as always, happy wargaming!